Hello, Jacob Appelbaum. You just had a talk with Dimitri Kleiner on social networks and surveillance. We're at Republica conference, and at the opening thesis speech, Eben Moglen talked about how social networks are becoming centralized and surveillance. You kind of had it, and we need to build decentralized alternatives. You just open up a different perspective with Dimitri, that the entire internet started out as a kind of social network that's always been decentralized, and it only became centralized and surveillance in the last, 10, 15 years. Can you elaborate on that? Why is that, and how can we fight it?
Well, I think that there's always been a certain amount of surveillance, but the question is the scale of the surveillance. And in the last 10 years, the surveillance, especially from people and groups like the NSA, that's the National Security Agency of the United States of America, those groups have gained a lot of power. There's a radical expansion of that power. So on the one hand, that is a reality now that we live in, which is that the internet is a surveillance machine, not necessarily by design, but certainly it is possible because all of the communication systems are dumbed down into small protocols that are easily identified and looked at in some way. And the fact that we started out with distributed protocols came from the fact that we were trying to build an internet that would resist a whole bunch of failures. So like if a city just fell off, the map one day, either because of atomic war, which threatens all life on the planet, or because of an accident or something like this, right? And so in a sense we did start with distributed systems. I mean, it actually started with small islands that became distributed so that the islands could function together. And this is something we actually have had and we are starting to lose, but we still have it actually. It is not the case that we have lost it entirely, but it is the case that many people today may have not experienced the distributed nature of the internet. And so I think the picture we painted is complementary to what Eben says, which is that we need to build alternatives. What we have learned is that what we had built before was not the only thing, and there are new things we need to consider in the services or ideas that we implement, and that's the really valuable thing, right? So it's not that Facebook didn't give us anything to offer. It showed the power of the network effect. Now how do we take that power and make sure that it doesn't just lie with one unaccountable body that is also subservient to a state which has very bad privacy laws, right? And so I think what he's talking about and what we're talking about, they are very much connected. I do think that Dima had a good point, which is that Eben talks about us coming from a centralized system to a distributed system, and it's important to talk about the actual history of coming from distributed systems, and there's a branch with a centralized system, and there's also still this line of distributed systems that exist together. In fact, Facebook couldn't exist without the distributed DNS system. It wouldn't be possible to have that without the free software communities driving, for example, the web servers or whatever behind Facebook. So Facebook, even though it is a centralized service, it's made up of many decentralized things. So the fact that some of the recognition goes to centralized services, and in fact a lot, like this month, billions of dollars of recognition go to that centralized service, it is not in itself the only reality, and in fact we have these parallel things that exist, and many people experience different ones. And Facebook is one, or Twitter is another one, where building alternatives to that will allow people to do the things that those services offer, but maybe not have the same trade-offs. And I think that's very powerful, and I think Dimitri had very eloquent things to say about how we have to view this in terms of collective struggle. And it's not just about Facebook, it's also about childcare, which sounds a little weird, but you have to remember that the trade-off there is about all of the things where we have public space and public utility, and we actually have a society, not just a collection of serfdoms. And so I think that, I really respect both of those guys for what they've had to say.
So what are the alternatives? How do we build them, and how do we get the people to use them?
Well, for example, thanks. Oh, no sugar for me, thanks. Yeah. So I think, that's some strong coffee. The question is, what are the alternatives? And I think part of it is a process of discovery. We don't always know what the alternatives are. For Twitter, there's StatusNet. This is the possibility for you to run this distributed protocol for federated microblogging. For instant messaging, you have stuff like, in the early days of instant messaging, you had like talk on Unix systems, which I don't think people really talk about that as instant messaging, but I met many friends over talk on Unix systems. That was, sort of superseded by AOL Instant Messenger, for example, and a lot of people use that, or QQ or ICQ or whatever, right? And now I think one of the big alternatives that exists there is Jabber. Most people know this as Google Chat, but Google Chat interacts with all of the other Jabber servers in the world in the same way that email does. So actually, instant messaging has taken on to an architecture that is a lot like email, but it has a different usage pattern. And this is actually good because it actually can contribute to privacy enhancing stuff. So for example, you can use off-the-record messaging combined with Jabber, say like jabber.ccc.de, one of the most popular Jabber servers that I know of, other than Google actually. And you can have really good secure communication that is decentralized to a degree, but not entirely, that you can then use to bootstrap other kinds of decentralized communication. And that's very valuable. Diaspora is an example of a project that's trying to create a decentralized Facebook. I think that there is a lot of value in trying to do that. I do think that reactionary stuff is maybe not as good as it could be if people were thinking very creatively about it. So I like Diaspora, but I'm not always a fan of the fact that it's framed as sort of like the response to Facebook. I think we have to think about it in terms of how can we have systems that we run ourselves, simple, that could be on our phone, where when someone wants to look us up, they don't ask Facebook for the data, they ask us for the data, and we say, Dimitri wants my phone number. Yes, I want to share that with him. Technologically, that's possible. It just needs to be written in some cases, and in other cases it sort of already exists in the form of like Android QR codes where you can share your contact information directly and someone else scans the barcode. The Guardian project in New York City, which works very closely with the Tor project, is working to build a whole bunch of privacy tools. So, for example, one of the things that they have done is ported Tor to Android. I helped Nathan to do that. And another important thing that they're doing is they built a Jabber client that by default, when it connects to jabber.ccc.de, it actually connects to the Tor hidden service over Tor and offers OTR. That's an alternative on an Android phone that works today. It's in the Google market. It's also free software, so you can build it yourself and you don't have to trust anybody. And I think that's a valuable alternative. Moxie Marlinspike wrote Text Secure, which is encrypted text messaging. It's, I think, really amazing because it means that one of the most surveilled mechanisms for communication, text messaging, which is really easy to analyze, all of a sudden the data that people and phone companies and governments are recording is now encrypted, and it's encrypted with keys that get thrown away at the end of the conversation, just like an off-the-record message. So now the data that they have is worthless. And I think that's a great thing. It's like use a channel of communication, which is supposedly free and open, to send messages that only have value for you, maybe. I mean, you have to be careful about the social relationships there, and Jabber, I think, is a lot better for that than SMS. But the fact that you can sort of recontextualize and actually secure an insecure medium, for the content at least, is very valuable. And there are free software implementations of all of those things. The Tor browser is available for people to be able to browse the web anonymously. Maybe all you want is location anonymity. Maybe you still want to use Facebook with it, and it will work. Facebook will know you're coming from Tor. They'll also maybe know what you assert is your real name. That can have a lot of value as well. And so those are a whole bunch of alternatives that no one even has to build. They already exist. People just have to choose to use them.
Now, being in Germany, talking about privacy on a web conference like this, you have heard about people asking whether privacy is still the real goal. It was 20 years ago. You have been pretty enraged hearing about so-called post-privacy so-called post-privacy advocates. What's your stand on that?
I mean, I think we can be post-privacy for some people when we're post-privilege. I mean, it's like, in the 80s, there were these guys that didn't believe that they could get HIV, so they never wore condoms because they could never be affected by it. And so now we have people that say they'll never be affected by the surveillance state, and they freely give up their data, and they give up their friends' data, and they don't acknowledge that there's a transitive risk, just like with HIV. And just like with HIV, we need a massive education campaign because what has occurred in the past from surveillance states is incredible suffering on a scale which is equivalent to a disease of society. And it's really scary, actually, to imagine that we have seen this happen in the 20th century, and we pretend for a second that a person who is physically not as strong as someone else is going to be treated equally all the time, simply because the law says so. Well, how about when the law doesn't say that? Well, because it doesn't say that right now, so how well will that go? And so looking at this, when people talk about this idea that, well, it's not a good business plan to do it distributed, so we must centralize it, we have to ask ourselves if the most important thing in the world is to have a good business plan, or if it is to have a strong civil society, which includes aspects of a so-called free market, but is socially constrained enough that it's not a free market for, say, genocidal weapons. We have some limits on those things, and we should have some limits on them, because if we don't have limits on them, it isn't really possible to maintain a democracy. It isn't possible, even with the veil of voting, to be able to call it a democracy when you don't have freedom of speech, freedom of thought, when you don't have freedom of movement, and all of those things are changed. And so when post-privacy people talk about that, I like to sort of suggest to them that they go and talk to a sexual assault victim and say, sorry that you were sexually assaulted, but gosh, now that happened to you, I think it's clear we live in a post-consent world. And that's, why no one would say that is because it's total bullshit. And I think it's important to call them out on that. Their privilege does not mean everyone shares that privilege. And we don't live in a post-consent world, and we shouldn't live in a post-consent world. And so when people talk about post-privacy, they need to talk about how they're waving their privilege around in a way which is not helpful to society and is in fact harmful. And on top of that is completely and patently ridiculous if you look at the history of the 20th century, but of all the centuries that were before it. And so I sort of mock and ridicule people that suggest that, but I also think they present a serious threat because they believe, in some cases, that it is legitimate to have no privacy. And that's very scary to me because they also contradict themselves by wearing clothes and having curtains on their windows and using SSL for their banking transactions. And they don't really recognize the trade-offs there. And so I probably shouldn't give them too much credit.
Post-privacy advocacy sounds really privileged. In the last year, there were many uprisings by less or underprivileged, non-privileged people in the world. We had a debate about Twitter revolutions, Facebook revolutions, or the other side of Evgeny Mozorov saying these tools not only help activists, but also the surveillance states. Who's right? Which side wins? Does the internet empower people or empower governments?
They're both right and they're both wrong. I mean, the reality is that for decades before the Egyptian revolution, there were people that were working on building cohesive social movements that had nothing to do with the internet. And the internet came and it helped them to some extent. But there were also a number of people that were surveilled, that were tortured for their passwords. That happens in Syria quite regularly, I've been told by Syrian activists. This type of stuff happens, as Evgeny Morozov is talking about. It is also the case that it is helpful. But the question is, if you have the ability to disintegrate a dictatorship, if you can't do that, it's going to go really badly when you lose because of the surveillance. And you see that the battle that's being fought in Syria right now by the Free Syrian Army or by the other rebels that are there or by the Assad government, you see quite clearly that the surveillance state benefits them. The internet also benefits those activists, but the costs are slightly different, and the price that an activist might pay will be a little bit higher, and often because of a technological difference, usually in terms of education, because people don't understand internet surveillance as well. That causes this sort of situation to be magnified in a sort of strange way. So they may not understand the reason they've been called in as their phone was in the same place as someone else. And I think you can't ignore that it's helpful to have these things, but you must remember that a lot of people, especially in the West, talk about this and say, well, it was a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution, and they're neglecting to mention the fact that they experienced the revolution through Facebook and Twitter. But that doesn't mean the revolution was only on Facebook and Twitter, right? That's a solipsistic attitude that their experience was reality, and it's not. The reality is that there was a broad social movement about many issues regarding to the justice of a lot of people. And the big downside to the internet is that it also enhances the surveillance, but the big upside is that it allowed the rest of the world to see the social movement they had already built, so they sort of brought it forward. And then it got more people involved because it was easy to involve them. But the people that are the biggest, basically, bringers of the of the revolutions in the so-called Arab Spring, I bet those are people we'll never meet. Many of them not on Facebook. A lot of them are behind the scenes and will never get credit. And that actually comes from the fact that they successfully used a strategy of revolution that did not include having a vanguard that would take over in the end. And there are obviously people that are well known, but I think that it's key that a big part of the success of toppling the dictatorships and resisting them comes from the fact that there isn't just like a head or there isn't a Che Guevara's head to cut off. And an irony is that when you have all this surveillance and you're watching everybody, you don't know which of those people necessarily are the most important people to watch, right? If that was the case, probably there wouldn't be a battle going on in Syria right now. It's still a difficult problem. So there are trade-offs, I think, in both of them. And we just have to remember that the surveillance is something that we can end a lot of the trade-offs. We can just say no more surveillance by changing the architecture of these systems, and then the internet will be in a much, much better place overall, and Morozov's concerns, I think, will be addressed. And likewise, we'll see that a lot of people will be able to liberate themselves with a little bit less risk from the internet, even though there's still a lot of risk from the physical world violence of the state, especially in places like Egypt and in Syria, where these revolutions are actually still continuing and they're not finished, right? January 25th revolution in Egypt is clearly not over, and what's happening in Syria is the same. And while Tunisia seems to be in good shape by comparison, Libya does not seem to be in the world's greatest shape. And of course, what about the rest of the world, right? There has yet to be an American Spring. And yet there is a lot of corruption and violence inherent in that system. And I think that's sort of amazing, right? Like I was on a panel with a State Department person or ex-State Department person recently, and she talked about how Assad had killed 8,000 people, and that was something that we as a community need to acknowledge as a serious problem, more serious than human rights violations happening in America, and that we have to do something about it. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I agree that we have to do something about that. What about the 1 million people that have died during our occupation and sanctioning of Iraq? What are we doing about that? 100,000 plus people killed by the American war in Iraq, which was illegal and immoral. She didn't have a good response to that, but there has to be a reckoning worldwide, and I hope it is a peaceful, democratic one through direct action, and that surveillance does not sabotage it for all of us.
Many surveillance technologies that are used by authoritarian regimes are built in Western countries and also used in Western countries. So is it enough to control the export of such tools?
No, controlling the export isn't going to help very much. I think it will help somewhat in that it allows us to attack the companies that are obviously contributing to genocides. For example, if there was a machete company shipping to particular countries in Africa during their civil wars, like say to Rwanda, we would not really find that to be good news. It doesn't mean we should ban machetes, but we do need to have some solution. I think the EFF has some ideas, like the Know Your Customer program, where you don't sell to a dictatorship. But we have to remember that ultimately the reason these things exist is because in a capitalist system, businesses seek to expand their market. They already built these things. They just wanted to sell them more places to make their market bigger, to make their market cap larger. They're willing to give up the authoritarian regimes if we pressure them, because the real money is coming from the rest of us, right? The surveillance systems exist in the democratic world. The so-called CALEA law in the United States, which creates this so-called lawful intercept, that exists specifically because the police asked for it and the government gave it to them. And there's a trickle-down effect where everywhere else in the world gets the telecommunications infrastructure with these backdoors built in, because of basically the Americans compromising on human rights values, because the police use scare tactics and the government use scare tactics. And it's very sad that that has occurred. But we have to stop that here. It's not just about restricting export. We have to stop surveillance, stop spying. And if we don't do that here, it will just be a matter of time before someone else builds these systems or exports them or teaches them there. We have to lead morally and democratically, not just technologically. And knowing your customer is a good step, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen. And it will be the case, and already is the case, that the Chinese and the Russians as well sell this type of stuff. And they also ship weapons to the Assad army. That is something which we also need to recontextualize. Surveillance equipment is part of the killing machine. You surveil people and then you kill them. That's what is happening. That's what's happened in Iran. And that is what is happening in Syria, and it happens all over the place. That's also what's happened in all of these American wars. And we don't have to accept that as a way that things are, and we can limit them just the way that we have with the rest of the arms industry. And we should do that, not just through export controls, but by saying we don't want militarized societies, and we don't want to have to deal with the threat of violence every single day that we exist. And we need to extend that privilege to the rest of the world as well, not just freedom from our crappy telecommunications infrastructure, but also freedom from serious violence and economic injustice.